Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. Whether it's your first time at a Royal Institute of Philosophy event or one of many, you're all most welcome. My name's Edward Harcourt. I'm a philosopher at Oxford, and as of about a week ago, I'm the new academic director of the Royal Institute. One of the odd consequences of having the directorship as a rotating post, and I think it's quite right that it should rotate, is that you inherit a whole year's worth of events from your predecessor. So although I'm the Master of Ceremonies for this evening, credit for devising this year's London lecture series and for issuing all the invitations goes to my predecessor, Julian Baggini. Now, the title of this year's series of London lectures is Words and World, and they all deal with some aspect of the philosophy of language. When I say philosophy of language, some of you may think of J.L. Austin and linguistic philosophy. Some of you may think back to the 1980s when I started doing philosophy and will remember Michael Dummett's remark that the philosophy of language is first philosophy. And I think some of what Julian had in mind when devising this series was to demonstrate how far the philosophy of language has moved since either of those two lines of inquiry, how much broader its agenda of questions has become, and of course, how many more traditions there are of which we're now aware, traditions of inquiry in which philosophical inquiry into the nature of language is carried on. And so who better to kick off this new series of London lectures than our guest this evening, Professor Chad Hansen. Professor Hansen is the Chair Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at the University of Hong Kong. He's held visiting appointments in a number of different institutions, including Michigan, UCLA, Pittsburgh, and Hawaii. And he's a former president of the Australasian Society for Asian and Comparative Philosophy. His talk this evening will be entitled A Modern Look at Ancient Chinese Theory of Language. Chad, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all. I was told it was a very general audience, but I just want to get a sense of how general. How many of you here would consider yourselves students of philosophy or professors of philosophy or anything in between? Okay. And now, how many of you can read the two characters at the bottom of the slide? Okay, so that's two groups in the know. My job in the next 30 minutes is to explain Taoist theory of language to the rest of you without boring those who've raised their hands. I think I can do it, but let's give it a try. The way I want to approach this is by talking about a Tao. In effect, I'm saying a Taoist, but really it's just a Tao-centered set of concepts for talking about language. And I want to contrast that Tao-centered set of concepts with the concepts that are familiar to all of us in Western philosophy, especially in philosophy of language. The Western concepts that I'm contrasting should be familiar to all of you, but especially those of you who've raised your hands before. It's concepts like words, concepts, meanings, ideas, mental images or ideographs. And there's relationships of representing, meaning, picturing, and the relationship between, as our title is, words and the world. These are generally semantic relations, and when we put those together into strings, we have thoughts. Thoughts are going to consist of the mental counterpart of words, and they will be expressed in sentences which have regular words in them. Beliefs are similar, and the things that for the most part in Western philosophy we talk about knowing are going to be those beliefs. Those beliefs will be known if they are true. Those of you who are philosophers know what the other conditions are. If they are true, and if they state facts. And that's also part of semantics. The relationship between the words and the compositions is called grammar or syntax. And there are rules of grammar, there are laws of logic, and there are definitions to take our words into more sentence-like constructions. And there's a narrative, and this is a narrative we all know. My sisters know it, so I know it's not a philosophical narrative at all. The narrative is about a child learning language who sees the fish in the pool and hears daddy say fish, and she says, pff, and I say, oh, she's got it. So she learns how to associate the sound fish with the image she has of a fish, and that's how we learn language. And we sum this whole thing up in a kind of, we've got a metaphorical picture that we all know of a cloud with thought bubbles, and then you have a balloon with words in. And the thought bubbles and the words are supposed to be, there are these two different worlds. There's this mental world, there's this language, and there's the outside world. And the mental life is the interface between language and the world. This is an old picture, and for almost all of us, it is pretty much common sense. It's just taken for granted. And I want to argue that it's common sense because we have a long tradition. We've inherited this conception of language and its role from our ancient Greek masters, from Aristotle in particular. And it has been around for so long that we do take it for granted. It's just the way we speak. But the reason we speak is because Aristotle originally had an argument for it. And the argument, quite famous one, is as follows. Writing represents speech. Speech represents images in the mind. Images in the mind represent things. The images in our minds are the same, the things are the same, the sounds and the writing are different. So that's the basic picture that we all take for granted in talking about language. Chinese theory of language is just as old. In fact, it's an amazing overlap between the classical period in Greece and the classical period in ancient China. Socrates and Confucius nearly overlap perfectly. Zhuangzi and Aristotle nearly overlap perfectly. And the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire nearly overlap perfectly. So it's a very interesting coincidence, but it's a very different theory of language. In ancient Chinese, for those people thinking about their language and thinking about language in the world, Aristotle's first premise doesn't make any sense because writing doesn't represent sounds. Writing represents things. For example, this one represents the sun and is used to talk about days. It has a history, and you can see that it has, in that history, it begins on the ancient oracle bone scripts as a circle with, is that a sunspot there or something else? It later becomes more squared and eventually takes this form. And this one, similarly, is the moon. And therefore, it's also a word for the month, for reasons we can easily understand. And it, too, has a history, starting with a picture, gradually getting stylized, and eventually taking this form. This one combines the two characters together. And we use it in the context where we like to talk about understanding, clarity, illumination, enlightenment, or any term like that. Don't think of these as the meanings of that character. Think of that character as using the notion of sun and moon to illustrate a certain general category of concepts that we might use. This is a perpendicular with a line above it. That's above. This is a perpendicular with a line below it. That's below. This is a box with a line through the center, and that's the center. That's the character that's used to represent the center, the middle kingdom of China. So that's Zhongguo. This is a tree. This is a grove or an orchard. This is a forest. So the first premise doesn't get off the ground. What about the relationship of sound and these characters? Well, as it turns out, Aristotle is talking about how we have different sounds in different languages for the same idea. Characters play that role in the Chinese theory of language as well. There are different ways the different dialects or languages in China say those characters. When I was learning Chinese, because my home language is Cantonese, this one is yat. When I went to Taiwan and learned Mandarin, it became ri. Or up north, it's going to be ri. In Putonghua, it's ri. These two, in Cantonese, seong ha. In Mandarin, shang xia. They have very little relationship to each other. The idea that those characters represent sound would make no sense to an ancient Chinese theorist about language. What makes those graphs represent the objects they represent? It's pretty clear, especially if we look at them now, that it's not because they look like the object. They don't anymore. But as we saw, there's a causal history in which the first element in that history was a picture, was intended to represent. The sun, in effect, is partially the cause of that character's being born, being cultivated by the sage kings who first wrote that character. And then it has a history down to this one. It's because of that causal link that this character can be said to represent the sun. We have a similar narrative, similar in a very broad sense, in the Chinese scheme and our own inherited scheme. And that is that the history starts with an object and leads to the mental idea, but in the case of Chinese, it's not mental. It's not about what's in your mind. It's a social object. It has a social history and a social reality. It has a social Tao. It has a social trajectory over time. And language is primarily about the relationship between words, a linguistic community, a society, its history, and the world. The mind is not central. Obviously, minds are involved. We'll say a little bit more about how later, but the story of language is a social story. And this is one of the ways in which we have this stereotype that the Chinese people are way more social and we, Westerners, are individualists. This is one of the ways that we are individualists. We think of language primarily in these individual terms, the mental, inner, subjective access to the meanings of terms. Whereas for Chinese, this is a public social thing. The social prominence is the first characteristic I want to point to in the Chinese theory of language. That is linked to the very process by which that history is made continuous. That's the process of teaching and learning. Confucius is most famous for his emphasis on the importance of education. First lines in Confucius's Analects, Ho, Yi, Xi, Zap, Ji, study and practice. Not just study, not just think, it's not about your beliefs, it's about what do you learn. Knowledge is related to learning, not to beliefs or experience. Knowledge is related to practice. So the concept of knowing that functions in this classical period in China is knowing how. You practice so you get good at. Good at what? Good at being able to read and write those characters. There's a special way of writing them. I can always tell when an artist is just copying characters from some Chinese scene because you can recognize they have done this for that character about the sun. And if you've studied Chinese, the first thing you know, there's a way, there's a Tao of writing that character, and it always goes like this. You haven't written it correctly unless you follow that Tao of the character. There's a way of using it, there's a way of writing it, there's a way of pronouncing it, there's a way of understanding it, there's a way of using it along with other pairs of other terms, with triples, fors, and so on. So these are Taos of the use of language. That's what we're mastering. Mastering a how to use the language by practicing it. And this focus on use makes the Taoists rather like the American pragmatists. I should say a little bit like the American pragmatists, because this is what we call the pragmatics of language. Wittgenstein, in trying to deal with the common sense Aristotelian view and attacking it, said, don't speak of meaning, speak of use. And most of us in philosophy think that actually they're not the same thing. They are different things. Pragmatics is about the relation of users of a language to the language. And that's a social matter. You do it correctly when you get approval from your teachers. The big difference with American pragmatism and Chinese Taoism is this. American pragmatists are all caught up in trying to reconstruct that ancient Greek rationalist basis. They want to give us a pragmatic definition of truth, pragmatic definitions of meaning, pragmatic definitions of belief, trying to get a pragmatic way of explaining all of those concepts I ask you to ignore for the moment. The Chinese Taoists obviously are doing none of that. They're just developing a theory of language that is first and foremost, in fact, almost entirely, a matter of pragmatics. I don't think it is entirely, because I will argue that in the end, semantics can emerge from the Chinese pragmatics. But I'll get there at the very, very long story in China. So the question you want to ask me is, I assume you want to ask me, is what is Tao? It's one of the most famous questions there is, and no one is supposed to be able to tell you an answer to it. But I think I can. So let's go. It seems to me that, well, first of all, let me go back to those of you who didn't know those characters on the front in the beginning of the lecture. That's Yao Dou in Cantonese, Yo Dao in Mandarin. The second word is Tao. The first one is simply, for those of you who know philosophy, the backwards E. It just says there exists Tao. Tao exists. The way we would say God exists, be the same structure. But Tao doesn't quite replace God. Tao is what is there because for the ancient Chinese, who were thoroughgoing naturalists, all they needed to know and what they asserted was, there is a way things happen. And we may not know what it is, and we won't speculate about what it is, but there is a way. So there's a path by which we got to this stage. The path metaphor is the way I want to approach looking at this Chinese conceptual scheme. It's social, it's a matter of skill, and it's based on the path metaphor. So I'm going to try and explain that concept scheme by looking at that metaphor. Metaphor theory, by the way, is a fairly modern, new approach in theories of language. I'm following Lakoff and Johnson in this. And it's what I need from that theory is not very much, just that we think of a metaphor as having a home domain. There's a place where the metaphor is just about something really, really basic. And for Johnson particularly, for Mark Johnson, it is particularly about the body, about navigating your body in a space. And there are arguments from modern theory of mind that can suggest that this is something very, very basic to how our minds operate. We map ourselves in a physical space. And being able to map yourself, being able to map your body, knowing its extent, knowing where you are, and being able to navigate it is the fundamental form of knowing for this kind of modern neuropsychological approach to the mind. So the metaphor is tapping into that extremely basic conception of what it is to be alive and alert. And the concept that goes along with Tao in the metaphor is just walking, Xing or Hang in Cantonese. And walking and the path go together as two parts of the metaphor. Now, what I want to do is contrast that with the metaphor that we are most used to, which is the metaphor of commands, rules, obligations. And I want to suggest that this is a very, very different metaphor for understanding the same broad category of things. Laws in the West are a way of understanding morality, normativity, but also causation. Natural process in the world is matter of laws. For the Chinese, Tao does this. The concept, the metaphor of the path, rather than the metaphor of a command or order, is the metaphor that guides us and also the metaphor that explains the unfolding of the world. This is the origin and history of the character for to walk. And as you can see, it starts with a path with a crossroads and a choice, gets stylized. And that character, that character becomes a metaphor in classical Chinese thought for any behavior. When you take the metaphor out of its home domain and apply it to the extended domain, your behavior is called Ching, or walk. I'm walking now that extended path domain. So there is the path metaphor. Lakoff and Johnson talk about a gestalt. And what I want you to do is not think about this as a picture, but think of this as a situation. You imagine yourself in this situation, and you have a conception of Tao in the home domain. There are two choices. It caused some philosophers in Singapore to argue with me, this cannot be a conception of normativity, because if it were a normative conception, it would, like the law conception, tell me which path I should take. This doesn't tell me that. This gives me two recommendations, two options, two possibilities, and then if I commit to one of them, then the path takes over and guides my walking. So this is a weaker conception of normativity, and it's not associated with an obligation, but with the Chinese concept of ke, possible, permissible, okay to do, or in the case of language, admissible, speakable, sayable, appropriate to say. So this is the basic metaphorical home. And we can put, to do a concept, to get a conceptual scheme, I want to put words in that gestalt context and explain how they function in the context. So I'm not just giving you the meaning, but saying how these concepts function in the context of being guided by a path of some sort. To start with, we have the character that a lot of those of you who raised your hand for knowing the characters will almost certainly know the concept of de. Dao and de form a pair in Chinese, meaning ethics or normativity in general. Anything about guidance, not just morality, but practical guidance, how to, let's see, what was, the art of motorcycle maintenance, art, all of these things can have Taos. There can be a Tao of any of these things. So Tao and De represent what you need for following guidance in that Tao gestalt. The word De is the word in the Chinese classic, the Tao Te Ching, second most translated classic in literature, I understand. I don't know if anyone's counted them, because the Bible is supposed to be the most. And I have my own translation of the Tao Te Ching, so I'm glad to add to that some 580, I think, is the current number of translations. The Tao Te Ching uses this concept of De, and the concept itself is kind of metaphorical. You can see the metaphorical structure of the concept. We're in this Tao situation. Here is the walking path part. This is the leftover of that path crossroads diagram we saw before. Here is a slightly distorted cross looking forward, and this, any problems identifying that? That's an I. And that becomes, in the full character, becomes this little 4-line thing in a box. But that's the original version of it. And this is a picture of a heart with its little bulging parts, the chambers of the heart, presumably. This eventually becomes, in the full character, 3 little drops of blood. And especially because my character here is red. This character is normally translated as virtue, and I put it up here as virtuosity. It can be competence, it can be mastery, it can be any of those things. The reason I like to use virtuosity is so you'll recognize it when you see it in translations, because everyone translates it as if it's virtue. And it's one of the crucial things that makes a leader a successful leader. The sage kings, the kings of the Zhou dynasty, were supposed to have gotten the mandate of heaven because they had duh. And if you read that as virtue, you think that they were avoiding sex outside of marriage. And that's not what the character is about. It has nothing to do with that at all. It has to do with being able to follow the path of good government and leading people down that path. Being a good leader is being a good pathfinder and follower. What does the eye, and by the way, the eye is just the first of these sensory organs. In the fuller account of this, any sensory organ displays to the heart is distinctions, not objects. Aristotle's theory of vision was that all of the objects are sending little pictures into my eye, and that's how they get into our mind. But for the Chinese, what this is doing is mapping the boundaries of different things. So they're the boundaries of the path are perceived by the eye, conveyed to the heart, and then the heart initiates, governs, and guides the walking. This bien character, made up of 2 parts that are nearly identical, separated by a language radical. So this is the basis for having language attached to the world. Not because it attaches to things, but to discriminatory differences, things that we may sense as being different from the other range of things. So there are boundaries of the stones, there are boundaries of the trees, boundaries of the path. And when we walk, we stay inside of those boundaries. The other 2 characters I want to introduce here are shi and fei, and these are translated as right and wrong, but literally they are this and not that. In other words, they are very, very indexical, and it's just a way of saying, in this gestalt, faced with these 2 options, I go this, and step off in one direction rather than the other. And when I do that, then the second phase of Tao guidance takes over. Once I've made that commitment to the path, to this path, and not that path, then this path structure is like a guidance information structure. It will take me along the way to something, but again, as I said before with Tao, we don't always know what. It's our choice to choose that path, but we cannot control what that path may lead to. So those are the characters, the core characters in this conceptual scheme for understanding the relationship of language and the world. For Lakoff and Johnson, the extended domain is an abstract domain. In China, as a matter of history and just simple fact, the first example of the use of Tao is already in an extended domain. But it's not abstract, it's not a Platonic world. Confucius is talking about a social world and a social Tao. And that social Tao is encapsulated in Confucius's famous concept of ritual, decorum, or ceremony, li. And li are habitual practices. Now remember, study and practice. Study and practice. I acquire this capacity to execute this ritual when that possibility presents itself. And that's the li. And for Confucius, the li are tied quite importantly to names. Notice I'm using names, not words. But by names, I don't mean Edward and Chad. By names, I mean professor and director. In other words, these are status roles, and the rituals are always rituals related to two status roles, famous Confucian relationships. So that the ritual between my father and myself is going to be a way of greeting him. All of that is governed by social norms. The social norms on the metaphor of a path that are enshrined in the practices. And we learn them by mimicking the behavior in time and space of our elders and our teachers and so on. So we learn to execute these paths in a social space where the names pick out significant actors. That's the most important for Confucius, but it actually goes beyond merely pairs of status roles and people to include ritual objects. For Confucius, he mentions particularly hats. When is this hat the right hat for using in this ceremony, in this burial ceremony? When is this goblet the right goblet for this stage in the ceremony? And anything that has a role in a social practice, therefore has a social name. There's a name for it, and Confucius is very concerned about rectifying the names. Get the name on the right object, or you will not perform the ritual correctly. Nothing here about the world, is there? It's all about performing that ritual correctly. And those conventional practices are going to be performed correctly if you stick the right names on things and you've learned the ritual performance. You've learned how to walk those social vows in that social space. It kind of helps to get more sympathy for Confucius's picture of society if we notice that he often takes this word li and pairs it with the word for music. And one of the things we know about the burial ceremony in China, the important one to these Confucians over and over again, is that it was a very, very involved ceremony that involved music, our acrobats, chanting, even dancing. We can see pictures of this on the ancient burial tombs. And the music and the chanting help keep us all together, help keep us balanced, help keep us in order. We all end up with similar behavior at the right point. Each of us comes in like a musical orchestra. The flutes come in at the right place, the drums come in at the right place, and the performance goes beautifully. So Confucius's conception of society is a beautiful performance of this social role. All parts of society interact together following these social roles and the Taos of each role. So this is the basic framework, Confucius's version of it. I'm going to trace it on out through other philosophers in ancient and up to modern China, but that'll be very quick. What I want to do is get the basis there. Another interesting thing to notice, kind of a corollary to what we've said before, in China, there is not just one, in ancient China, that is, not just one category of things. There are several categories of things. There are qi, which are implements, utensils, objects that have a role in some human practice. And those objects are not natural objects. Those are social objects. So a knife, money, wedding presents, these are social objects. My name, my status, professor, is a social object. My search for it is longing for a kind of social status, a social goal. Plants, animals, mammals, whales are all natural objects because they are what they are no matter what human social practices are. They're objecthood is still linked to their Tao. They still have paths, but their paths are in nature, not in human social practices. Human social practices can include them, but they are governed by their natural Taos. So the words and the norms of the use of words are themselves entirely part of the social Tao for Confucius. Meaning is knowing how to use them correctly according to this old social tradition that Confucius inherits. Now I've reached the point where I'm going to do my run-through, and this will be very quick, but I just want to hit the outlines. What are the standards for correct use for Confucius? It's a little bit complicated, but the one I want to focus on is clearly the standard is we want to be doing these things the way the sage kings did them in the past. We inherit this system from the sage kings. We want to perform it beautifully. It's a kind of past orientation to a golden age. Confucius is quite famously conservative in this respect. And because I wanted to get this corollary in, the ruler in Confucius' conception is not someone who makes law, not someone who commands. The ruler is like the conductor of an orchestra. His role is to make sure the piece is interpreted correctly, beautifully, and in harmony. But he does not compose the piece. That was composed by the sage kings who devised the rituals and the names in the first place many generations ago. Confucius inherits it and tries to preserve it. He wants to preserve it into the future. So Mozi, his first rival, attacks that very weak spot. Here we are playing this song, and we may play it very beautifully, but mightn't there be a better song to play? Maybe there should be a role for a bassoon. Maybe we could play it in a different, insert another section, playing a different tempo with just the interpretation. But we could introduce different sections, or just start with a whole new song to play together. Why not play a social Tao that is completely different from this one? How are you going to choose it? And what does it look like? And Mozi brings nature back into the dialectic by saying, yes, you're quite right. There has to be a Tao of choosing this new social Tao. He has a very elaborate one, and I won't even start to spell it out. But what he's arguing is that when we do this, when we design this new social Tao, we are going to be following Tian, heaven, or nature's. We're following nature's will. What is nature's will? Well, for Mozi, nature's will is that human beings should thrive and live good lives, flourishing lives, well-being. Mozi argues that Tian, nature, is biased toward humans. Tian wants humans to be well off. And therefore, in obedience to Tian, we should reform our social institutions, including all of the names we use. So the whole structure of names is going to be reformed to bring about the greatest utility. If Mozi had ever carried this off in full form, in the way that he intended, if he could have done that, it would have been like what we call in modern science a scientific realist. Just the opposite. Scientific instrumentalist. Someone who thinks that the good of science is not that it describes the real world, but that it leads to human benefit. So that's the pragmatic element coming back in Mozi. This is a version of evolution that I consider naive because it was the version I learned as a child. When I learned about dinosaurs, I learned that dinosaurs were all over the earth and dominated the earth. They were big and strong and nobody could beat them, but they were so dumb that they just died out because evolution was trying to produce us with our magnificent brains. We know that this is not the way evolution goes, but that's how Mozi is reasoning. He's not using, by the way, he's not using the argument from design to argue that there is a God, that there is a Tian. It's obvious there's a 10. That's the sky. That's the order of nature up there. What he's arguing is nature is biased toward us. Nature wants us to evolve. Nature wants us to come out. It is Mozi who gives us this language that I talked about before of distinctions and shi and fei. Mozi's, what I was trying to say before, if you carried out Mozi's process, it would be what we call in philosophy of science, carving nature at the joints. You're making the distinctions where nature makes those distinctions. Mozi actually has several different parts to his theory, but I'm going over my time. So I'm going to not go through all three of them, look at the focus on the distinctions and the way you make those distinctions being guided by a kind of utility and the assumption that nature wants us to succeed. Nature wants us to live well. This is where the Taoists come in. Taoists say, nah, come on. Nature doesn't care about us. Nature just unfolds the way it unfolds. And we find opportunities in nature. We find Taos in nature. There's no Tao of nature. There's no nature telling us to do something. It's not nature commanding us in that sense. Nature gives us options. We make the choice of those options. And the way to talk about that choice for someone for a Taoist is 自然, which we almost always translate naturally or spontaneously. But in fact, the characters tell you what it's about. It's about self-realizing. There are those possibilities out there, and we, from here, this point, realize that possibility by walking it, by executing what we've learned, a practice that we've learned, so that we can get to that, to something. We don't know always what it is. There's no transcendent right or wrong. The Taoists are rather skeptical about that. All are from natural points of view, and there's no determinism. So Taoist conception of this is that the social Tao is going to develop in relatively experimental ways and somewhat haphazardly. But here's the thing to notice about Chinese philosophy and how it's different from Western philosophy. The dialectic is not between an inner belief and an outer fact. The dialectic is between a social Tao and a natural Tao. And we're trying to say, what is the social Tao that will result from the full operation of natural Tao over time? So when modern Taoists come along, this is now jumping 2,000 years of history of the development of this theory. When modern Taoists come along, they immediately embrace evolutionary theory. This is a great surprise to a lot of people who think that Taoism is all about mysticism and superstition and irrationalism. They glommed onto evolutionary theory and science and logic way before the rest of the intellectuals in China. And that's pretty obviously because they were always naturalists. And what they're seeing in science is a social Tao that does lead to a lot of good and is experimental and is open and can correct itself over time. So the correct language ultimately is going to come from the world, but it emerges gradually. And that correct use of language with the correct marking of distinctions, that's the relationship between language and the world. We get our semantics at the end, as I said. Now you might feel a little cheated because I've been talking about Taoism and I've said nothing about all this great mystical object. I'm prepared to talk about it, but I think my time is getting nearly up. I'll show you a picture of great Tao that you recognize as a picture of the evolution of the universe. Great Tao is the Tao of everything there ever was through all time. That's the great Tao. The question that comes up in Taoism is, should I follow great Tao? And I think the answer, and this is an answer that I think we find in Zhuangzi, is, yeah, you will follow great Tao, not because great Tao commands you or fate, or there's some kind of fate in great Tao. You will follow great Tao because great Tao just consists of what each and every one of us does. and therefore anything we do will be in accord with great Tao. The universe will unfold the way it does because you and I make the choices that we do. Let me just summarize by emphasizing the way in which this Tao conception of normativity, this Tao conception of guidance, is different from the Western law conception. First, its modality is permission, not requirement, duty, obligation. It's not about what you ought to do or should do, but what is permissible, possible, advisable, maybe even recommended, but not necessarily an obligation. Its source is nature and time, because Tao is always unfolding, so the opportunities are changing all the time as nature unfolds. The source of the law metaphor is someone's authority. Maybe it's a whole legislature, maybe it's an individual person, maybe it's God, but there's someone in authority to pronounce the law and say what it is you ought to do. The Tao process, as I say, has phases. First of all, you find it because it's out there in the world. You may not know it's there. Secondly, you choose which one to follow when you found them. And then there's the following or interpreting or enacting it in reality by walking it. And that requires knowing how to do the behavior. The law process is semantic and logical. So the relationship between a law and an action that violates the law is almost a straightforward logical relationship. The Tao conception is marked by a kind of degree of probability, plausibility, or recommendedness. It's not an absolute, not a complete one, whereas law is more absolute. Law has a kind of necessity or a sort of guarantee. And its metaphorical link is to future outcomes, often unknown. We cannot be sure of them. The metaphorical link of law is to punishment. Some people think of this as a conceptual link. Lots of arguments about justifying punishment that way. The Taoist conception, in other words, is somewhat more consequential, although it's not it's not a straight out-and-out utilitarianism because they reject moza, but it is consequential because the path leads forward in time, whereas the law conception is pretty clearly deontological. When I began studying Chinese philosophy around 61 years ago, I was a philosophy student, and I began looking through these Chinese texts, trying to find all the evidence I could of philosophy in China. So I'm looking for all of these concepts, the concept of reason and argument and logic and laws and so on. And I began to write papers about why I couldn't find them, what I wasn't finding. And eventually, over those years, over a great many of them, every concept I couldn't find, I've blacked out. And where I find a concept that's a little bit like it, but not very much, that's gray. And where it's just a little bit gray, well, it's still not quite the same concept. And what we all do, almost instinctively, what I was trying to do and what most people do in dealing with Chinese philosophy, is try and take the ones that are left and still think of them as if they're operating in this environment. And that's what I've asked you not to do. The ones that are left, I suggest we should understand Taoism and Chinese philosophy with this conceptual scheme, this map of the mental world, this map of concepts and ideas for dealing with the world. And what I think, and I'll try and defend when you start your questions, is I think we can get along quite well with that. I think that's enough. Any questions?
Questions, please.
Hi. I've been reading a fair amount of early Chinese philosophy in translation, and I keep coming across the word therefore. So whether it's Lao Tzu or Chunzi, maybe in Menches as well, you get well, not so much in Menches, but the sage does this, and he does this, and he does this, and therefore, and then there's something like a conclusion that, or I take it as a bit like a conclusion, and I'm thinking, I wish I'm using Chinese here because I want to know what therefore looks like in classical Chinese, if that makes sense.
Yes, it's related to the concept of ancient, and it has to do with a causal chain, with a causal process actually, which is a Tao, the causal Tao. And so he does this and this and this, and the causal Tao leads to that. That causal Tao may operate through words and thoughts and arguments, but they don't talk about arguments. They don't have premise and conclusion in that. So it is almost always just, yes, this, and then this, and then this, and therefore that. And it's sometimes translated as inherently, because it has to do with the fundamental, this object and what its is, what that object can do in this situation. So when you get in a causal account, sequential causal account, that's what that therefore is doing. It's not too misleading, because we use therefore that causally as well, a lot. Yeah. But if you think of it as logical, one of the things that's really important is these ancient Chinese philosophers never discovered logic. Logic is something that we transferred, taught them in that modern period. The Taoists, as I say, glommed onto immediately. As a matter of interest, logic first was introduced into China by the Buddhists, who have a form of logic. And it just didn't catch on. It went nowhere. A few people learned it, but it didn't become a powerful tradition. Nobody sensed that it was important. Came again with the Jesuits, who were came over in the 17th century, and all of the Chinese intellectuals thought this was just a trick to try and get us to believe in their alien god. Because, of course, they use their logic, and they got the ontological argument, and they say, see. So here, and they're saying, I'm not going to fall for that. You can't convince me of that. So logic never caught on until it was linked to evolution and science. And then, oh, good, that makes sense. And now one of the foremost Taoists of modern Chinese thought is a big student of Russell's. Logical positivism and the whole bag. Sorry.
Who is that? Sorry.
Jin Yuelin.
Okay.
More description of Chinese, the evolution of Chinese ideographic language, which is what they use, and the fact that it allows for different ways of doing things, seems to be at odds with the way Confucianism in certain areas and in certain pockets has been adapted and become so rigid to the point that social names, social ranks have become so much part of the language that the I as an agent is almost lost. It's a very Western idea, the I as an agent, of course. Yes. But there's a contradiction there that I'm finding difficult to even articulate, the authoritarian, the hierarchical, and all that. Yeah. It seems to be at odds with the evolutionary, experimental Taoist thought. And it's also at odds with the fact that the whole ideographic way of seeing the world related to the social should allow, I'm using should, which again is not the right word, but you would think would allow for a lot more fluidity. How, in either a philosophical way or a historical way, has that occurred?
Well, as I said, I skipped over a whole lot, and there's a very important Chinese philosopher named Menches, Mengzi, and he takes a view that kind of eliminates language from the story. It's quite true that in theory of language, the Confucians are almost knee-jerk conservatives. It is a very, no way around it. It's a very, very conservative philosophy because its emphasis is on the knowledge that is contained in a tradition, which is the core idea of don't change the tradition because you'll mess things up. But Menches thinks that there's, in human psychology, a capacity to find the Tao by intuition, Now, I was kind of trained to be really suspicious of intuition, because if your intuitions and mine differ, we just have to see who's tallest or strongest, or who gets the endorsement of the president or whatever else. So intuition doesn't seem to give us very much of a guide in the kind of context that we're occurring in China, where there's disagreement. But as a matter of freeing Confucianism from this dependence on the past, it definitely does that. And it even kind of makes it, for Menches, an internal thing. I've emphasized how social it is. But for Menches, it is the Xing. The heart has the paths transcribed on the heart. So when I get someplace in life that needs me to have a certain behavior, my heart already is kind of, do you know Leibniz at all? Kind of like Leibniz's monads. The whole thing, the whole map of the universe is inscribed inside my heart. So when I get to this situation, my heart tells me just exactly the right thing to do.
There was a question over there. Yeah.
So when you're talking about the Tao and this way of thinking, you're emphasizing a historical dynamicness to it and also indeterminateness to it. And there's a lack of a kind of Cartesian dualism. Doesn't sound like they're going to worry about like the thing in itself, right? To me, this sounds very similar to like Hegelianism, at least what Hegel was trying to do, because this is very unified. I'm just wondering, like, in this kind of theological worldview, is that going towards a kind of absolute place, and what does that look like, or is this constantly indeterminate?
Yeah, you're not the first one to have suggested that. It's a very obvious kind of suggestion, especially when you think of the relationship of Hegel and pragmatism. The idea that but for Hegel, remember, it is so linked to this great, it's reason working itself out in history. That's not the way the Tao goes. Tao is just this process of nature working itself out in history. And in the process, our societies evolve in relation to that natural process, so that eventually we come to, in an evolutionary way, come to more and more efficient societies that mark boundaries of things in better ways. So it looks, I do agree that it looks a lot like Hegel, but Hegel has got reason all over his.
So for Hegel, he would say maximizing freedom is the most efficient society. Was efficiency here?
Well, that the historical process is reason working itself out in history. The Taoists are saying it's the natural process working itself out. Reason is an obvious substitute for God in this case, isn't it? It's God's purposes in creation being realized in creation's unfolding. So I think it is like that, in that Hegel's is very much a process philosophy, and so is Taoism, and Whitehead and other process philosophers.
One question, considering I've been reading a little bit about Chinese history, and this seems to naturalize kind of Chinese history, considering there's constant conflicts and battles and wars, even within the imperial regimes, let's say dynasties and complete revolutions, etc. So this seems to kind of bypass that. Is that deliberate? Is that kind of a way of trying to avoid that constant historical change? Well, there's no conflict and change in this philosophy, and then also linguistically as well.
It is naturalistic in the sense that it's not guided by a supernatural intelligence. So even the Confucians are naturalists in that sense. But they are also humanists. So the Confucians are about kind of human priority. The Taoists are saying, well, that every animal is, we are another of nature, of the natural creatures of the world. And what we're doing and following a path for us is the same thing snakes and ants are doing. There are paths for them as well in nature.
I suppose I'm trying to ask, is there evolution and change in this process? Because the history, obviously history, Chinese history, there is.
Yeah, there is not very much evolution and change, and that's partly, and I would blame that on the fact that Confucianism has been the dominant philosophy. which is committed to maintaining this stable form of society that worked for us in the past. And the Taoists, just as a matter of political observation today, the Taoists are the kind of Chinese liberals arguing for greater freedom in China. Not because they're individualists, but because they don't see this authority and authority structure as the way that society should develop. So, but as to struggles, and yeah, there's no question that, as I said before, it's very experimental. And when Zhuangzi talks about the 8 da, the 8 capacities you have for making selections of paths, one of them is war. You go to war to see who wins, and the winning society, well, okay, that's where history goes. That's very realistic and a little bit depressing, I suppose.
Yes.
Especially today.
Yes, thanks very much. I'm thinking about the Aristotelian way of thinking of language and the kind of social Tao way of thinking of language you described. And that reminds me, I think a result in experimental philosophy.
What?
Experimental philosophy.
Yes,
So I think in 2008 or something like that, some philosophers did the very famous Putnam twin Earths experiment in the US and the UK and I think Hong Kong, and later some people also did that in mainland China.
I'm sorry, repeat the name of the experiment
Sorry,
again.
the twin Earths.
Oh, twin Earth experiment, yes, okay, good. The thought experiment.
Yeah, and I think the result is that in the US and the UK, people have a very strong externalist intuition in the place.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the Hong Kong people and in the mainland have a kind of very strong internalist intuition.
Yeah.
And that makes a very interesting correlation with the kind of difference you're trying to describe. I just want to know how you feel about this correlation.
I have looked at some of those, the experimental philosophy kinds of things. This one sounds like an interesting one, but one I haven't looked at in detail. So I'm not so confident about how I would explain it. But on the face, I would think it's because the Hong Kong students, the Chinese students with the traditional background, I want to be a little bit careful about this because my experience with Hong Kong students is most of them that think about the way all of us do, because they've learned English and they've acquired this whole Western scheme of thinking about the world. But in terms of the difference I'm trying to mark for the ancient Chinese, it is clear that there's a sense in which language is self-contained in the social Tao. So the relations are going to be internal more for Chinese. But I don't know that I can explain the actual Chinese result that way. There are other of those results I have. I mean, one of the things that the Richard Nisbet at the University of Michigan has argued is that Chinese people are more tolerant of contradiction. And there are people running around with various schemes that the implicit conception in China of logic is of I'm getting so bad on names now. Paraconsistency, where they are more tolerant of contradictions. I just am really skeptical about that, just because, I see these ancient Chinese, and they do react to contradictions, not because they have a word for a contradiction, and not because they're reasoning logically, but they just say, that's nonsense. That's like trying to do this and this at the same time. So I'm not sure I'm convinced with all of those. But the biggest thing is that there's actually a big difference in what, in fact, when I do my work on Chinese philosophy, I make it a point to focus on pre-Buddhist Chinese philosophy. Because in my view, Buddhism brings in 3/4 of this Western structure of concepts and way of looking at language. So I don't think that it remains the same theory along in history. I do think there are elements of it. I mean, my colleague, rival, friend, Roger Ames insists that there's less impact of Buddhism than I say. I don't know how much there is, but I do know that the conceptual opportunities have changed with the introduction of Buddhism. There's, for example, there is a truth predicate, straightforwardly. Yeah.
So I think that you've argued quite convincingly that Tao is the dominant metaphor, or was in ancient China. But I guess I would be curious for you to elucidate what concepts of law might have existed and why you think the Tao was so dominant against those concepts.
Okay. Number one, in terms of Tao's dominance, I should add that there's a second concept that's important in Neo-Confucianism, also found in Taoism, that is essentially the same metaphor. It's the path metaphor Li, which we translate as principle, but is actually the lines in jade that make possible a certain carving that has a certain kind of beauty, and so on. So I will claim that the path metaphor is dominant, and both Li and Tao share that focus on the way the world is structured such that certain things are possible, and therefore, and those are the things to be exploited and used by us. Now, in explaining that, what was the second part of your question?
Concepts of law.
Oh, concept of law, yes. I skipped a lot, obviously, about the Moas, and one of the things about the Moas is they have a concept that is a Tao-like concept. It's an operation, but it's an operation with a measurement tool. So the Moas, when they talk about rectifying names, they use examples like a carpenter's square, or a plumb bob, or a balance beam, or a bushel, something that takes a certain quantity that we might disagree about and give us a more precise, definite answer. And as Moza puts it, that we can see with our eyes and ears, so that it's accessible, he argues, to the ordinary person. There was a quite lengthy argument and dispute in classical China leading up to the legalists about the importance of making punishment. By the way, although I said there was no law, there certainly were punishments. In fact, the Chinese punishments are famous, but they're not linked to laws. They're just, I'm the ruler and I just punish when I punish because I'm going to lead you, and so I instill a certain amount of fear into you. But these people are arguing it would be better for everyone if those punishments were marked so that everyone could see them clearly with their eyes and ears, if they were as clear as measurements are. So if they were like operational measurements, then it would be better to have, you could have punishments and people could, as Shang Yang puts it, avoid them. And people would be happy to avoid them if the lines are clear. But now you've got all these people talking about their intuitions, their moral intuitions, and punishing me because I don't conform with their moral intuitions, and I have no way of predicting that. So that was the concept of Fa. In the Moas, it's a measurement instrument. The legalists took it over, and they use it as a regime of very, very strict punishments. They still don't invent the concept of a syntactic law, a universal statement with necessity, or a modality of obligation. They have rather the idea that punishments ought to have attached to them a measurement-like quantity that makes measurement-like operation that everyone can know so that everyone's able to avoid them. It went badly wrong, in part because the rule of law works for us because we do have logical structure, and we can talk about the principles behind the law and the coherence of the law. They didn't have that apparatus available to them, and the whole thing collapsed after just one generation. I think you know that. Yeah.
I'd be very interested to find out a bit about your view on comparative philosophy, cross-cultural philosophy, what you do, and also how your personal experience looks like with that, your engagement with philosophy, both Western and non-Western in that instance. Maybe in particular with respect to the kind of two frameworks of concepts that you brought up here. and how philosophical dialogue in a space that takes seriously both of these traditions can look like. Like, do we still think that some concepts in either of these frameworks still exhaust the logical space and that it makes sense to ask these questions? Does it even make sense to think about adjudicating between possibilities? And what is it that comparative philosophy can do, or what is it that we can do when we want to ask questions, theoretically or practically?
So I'll leave out the personal stuff and go back to it if you want, but let me answer the theoretical question first. As to philosophy, it seems to me that what I've explained here, and what I tried to do and make accessible even to people who aren't philosophers, is understanding these. When I talk of conceptual schemes, I'm not doing what Davidson does and claiming that they're somehow inaccessible or untranslatable or cannot. I just think it is very understandable. I think there's a certain sense in which it's just common sense. And I guess what I actually think is, I'm a little bit inclined to argue we might be better off having more Tao in our meta-ethical naturalism, because meta-ethical naturalism is still very controversial. And it's very difficult to get off the ground because we have so many intuitions about morality that require some kind of authority, whether it's Kantian pure reason or God or some kind of agreement from the whole. We are always in this process of trying to justify some sort of authority behind the law in order to give the law some kind of natural force. And then you've got all these arguments against that. Are there any facts about the world that create obligations for you and me? And the answer to that, I think Mackie intends the answer to be, no, that's obvious. Obviously that can't be. So that you have this very strong barrier against naturalism. If you think of normativity as being on the Tao model, then naturalism just flows off the scheme. There are these structures of guidance in nature. It's not as complete as a command, it's not logical, but it's in the world. And I can find that guidance in the world, and the result is science is the handmaiden of morality.
Can I try a sort of follow-up to that? Well, may not be how you understood your question, but what I understand to be a follow-up, which is those two diagrams at the very end of your talk really impressed me, because what I thought you were saying is, look, if you try to map Anglophone concepts onto Chinese concepts, you're going to fail. They're just these two schemes, and the same word, none of the same words occur on both.
Some of them do, but they're not in that structure.
Well,
if you try and keep that structure, then they're just not going to work the same way.
Okay, because it seemed to me as if you were saying that there are these two incomparable schemes, really they can't enter into conversation with one another. But here you are saying, well, actually, if we want the correct answer to the very Western question, is naturalism in ethics true, we can just borrow something from the Taoist framework. Yeah, so there is this lively conversation.
Yeah, there is. I do. That's why I say I think I can make it. I know that I'm not supposed to be able to explain what Tao is, and I think I can. I think we can understand it, and when we understand it, we can see how it works. And we can see that this gives us a conception of natural normativity that is pretty much straightforward. As I say, I'm not Davidson. Davidson thinks that conceptual schemes are just so impossible that we can't possibly imagine there is one. And obviously, I don't mean a whole conceptual scheme. I mean, this metaphorical structure around understanding normativity and guidance. And I think we can understand that, and I think maybe we should. But I want to say something more about that other issue, because you raised that about my experience in working with Chinese philosophy. And that really is to be, even when I went to Hong Kong, I feel like I need to stand up because nobody can see me, but so I'll be informal. When I went to Hong Kong and I began learning Cantonese, I wasn't more than maybe 3 or 4, maybe 6 months into it, and I just had this realization. The thing that's standing in my way of understanding and speaking Cantonese is that I'm an English speaker. If I could not be an English speaker, I'd be able to pick this up the way the 3-year-old children in Hong Kong are picking it up. They're just going like 90 miles an hour in this Cantonese, this language I think is so hard. So I began listening mostly to children because I was trying to pick up those differences. But then here's the thing that English makes me do. To be an English speaker, I'm going to use the tone of my voice, in fact I'm wearing it out tonight, in order to emphasize, right, in order to explain, in order to take certain attitudes, to be positive, to be conclusive, to be probabilistic, maybe to be sarcastic, maybe to have doubts. And in Cantonese, all of these are words I add at the end of a sentence, because every word has a tone, one of 11 tones. And you have to say that word in exactly that tone. So when your sentence comes out, it has a tonal structure already there. And if I want to express emotion, put a word on the end. Boy, did that seem unnatural. Weird, talk about how, but a year later, I start using these and they just feel like perfectly natural things. They just roll off my tongue, they come out. I couldn't understand how you can possibly communicate to people without tense, and without gender, and without case, and without number. A few months later, why did I think I needed those things? I don't need those. I'm fine. And that's what I think about Chinese philosophy. We're looking at this. Everyone else is out there trying to say, okay, yeah, they're talking about it's philosophy because here are all these concepts. I say, no, I don't think that's the way to go about it. It is philosophy. It is philosophy because it's got an interesting theory of normativity, interesting theory of language. And language, as we know from modern times, is the key to philosophy. I was the first one to look closely at the Chinese theory of language because most people believe that the Chinese believe you should never talk. That the proper thing to do is stay in silence. If that's the case, they must believe something about language that makes it important not to speak. And I better find out what that is. So that's when I began doing this with the concepts. I'm looking to see. I use, by the way, I don't know, do you know Willard Van Orman Quine? So he got the idea of radical translation. And I was basically trying to use radical translation. Can I get a translation manual that operates according to rules and grammatical structures so that I can make as many of these sentences as possible come out intelligible, at the very least, in Chinese. And that's when I began to find, no, if I keep using those concepts, they're going to come out stupid. They come off saying wrong things. They don't look like philosophers when you translate it that way. That's why it's hard to convince a professional philosopher that Chinese is philosophical. The translations out there are just, I don't think it's philosophy either. I think that's nonsense. It's just gibberish. And I don't think they were doing gibberish. I never thought they were. One of my teachers at university, Jaguar Kim, one of the smartest men I know, but I did not believe that these people were dumb, bad philosophers.
I think we've got time for one more question, if there is one. Yeah.
Sorry, it's me again, but you've made me think of something else. Your question did about comparative philosophy. From what you said, and from my own experience of different languages, including Chinese and Korean, the thought processes involved in the languages almost create a different linguistic and cultural and social ecosystem from the ones that Western people occupy. To what extent can there be a genuine dialogue, as it were, between philosophies that are embedded in different languages?
My experience in, as I say, these 60 years has been that when I talk about Chinese philosophy to professional philosophers, I mostly get a very positive reaction. Oh, they say, oh, yeah, that's philosophy. Weird, but philosophy. They recognize it as philosophy. And the reaction I get from my other sinologist friends is, no, you got it wrong. This is what that word means. That's the dictionary translation. That's the dictionary definition in the Chinese English dictionary. And I say, actually, I don't think it is the correct translation. I think if you get the correct translation, it will look like philosophy. And I won't have any trouble in dialogue with my colleagues. And I've been in, well, Edward mentioned some of the universities I've been at. I've never had trouble communicating with other philosophers what's going on in Chinese philosophy. I don't think it's impossible to communicate between these two. And I hope that we do, because it will certainly help in understanding those cultures who may, after we finish with this war that's in front of us, may be our next war. I hope not.
Well, that's a heavyweight thought to end on, but my watch tells me that we should end here, although I'm sure we explore further, but let's not bring things to a close without thanking Chad very much for his talk, and thanks to all of you for the discussion.